2050 is not that far from where we are sitting. So we have to have these systems fully matured over next 10 years, maximum 15 years. So the biggest element here is the policy certainty, one, and two, policy certainty at a fairly macro scale across the borders, across the countries.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by Aniruddha Sharma, CEO and chair of point source carbon capture company Carbon Clean. Aniruddha, thank you so much for being here. It's a true pleasure to have you on the show, and I really can't wait to dive into all the exciting things Carbon Clean has been up to lately. But before we really do, it's tradition on the podcast that we get to know our guest's background first, so please do tell us a bit about what you used to do before starting the company.
Great. Well, thank you for having me here. This is my first podcast for 2025, so I'm kind of quite excited about what 2025 holds. Right. What I used to do before Carbon Clean was nothing. This is my first job. I started the company from my university dorm room along with my co-founder. When we were in our final years of education at the university, I went to study at Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur in India. And this was one of the most pressing issues we used to discuss and debate a lot, like what can we do about climate change? How can we reduce the carbon emissions going up in the air? So we decided to do something about it and start a technology company that will address those challenges.
Excellent. Actually, this is quite rare on this podcast. That's why I usually ask this question, because people come from all sorts of different backgrounds, because climate tech is still relatively new and carbon capture more so. But what inspired you to go into carbon capture specifically?
Yeah, I think there were maybe two things that inspired me to go into carbon capture specifically. One was just the passion, right? So IITs in India is a university brand name that's very well known for technology and solving hard technical problems. Some of the best tech CEOs comes from the IIT university. So I think there was a passion for solving hard problems, especially in this case in climate tech. Both myself and my co-founder, we were quite involved in the climate tech movement on campus. And even at that point of time, there was a group called Indian Youth Climate Network. We were members of that. I used to write the position papers, policy papers. And then we would then take them to the government in India. And not only just in India, we actually attended a couple of COPs, the International Climate Change Conference, to make the point, and sometimes actually go out and sit on the streets and shout the slogans and all that. So I've kind of done all of that. And then I think at some point of time, we realized that just shouting slogans and writing policy papers and writing letters to the politicians is just not going to work. It's not going to cut it. So we started looking for technology solutions. My co-founder, who's also our CTO, his university project was actually focused on carbon capture, which is essentially a suite of technologies, fairly well proven, but suite of technologies that can decarbonize large industrial assets. So it was his university thesis, trying to find a new technology that can reduce the cost of carbon capture very significantly. And there we happened to actually have a conversation one of the evenings. I think we're probably having coffee or something like that. And I asked him, so what's your dissertation? What's your thesis? And he said, well, I'm developing a new technology for capturing carbon dioxide from point source emitters. And I asked him a question, so who's doing it in India? He said, nobody. So I said, why don't we do it? And that was it. That's how we started. You could probably say, and a lot of people, I guess the advice of a lot of people, we went to quite a few entrepreneurs. We obviously had this conversation with friends and family, and everyone said it's stupid, don't do it. And then the time was quite peculiar, right? 2009-10 was the time when the financial crisis was still around. That was the height of it. So people said, you're just nuts that you're going to start a company in climate tech space in India when nobody actually cared about carbon emissions in that point. And two, you're going to do it in the middle of financial crisis. You guys are completely crazy. Don't do it. And we said, let's take this as a challenge. So we literally took it as a challenge. We started the business from there.
That's super inspiring. I'm also excited to talk to you more about the Cyclone CC series, so we can dive into more of what makes your technology different from what else is out there. So who stands to benefit from it, actually, and what makes Cyclone CC unique?
Yeah. So, early on when we started the company, we realized there were two challenges in the carbon capture space. One, the existing technology, which was invented probably in 1960s, 70s, was invented for natural gas treatment systems. It was not invented for carbon capture from point source emitters like power, steel, cement, waste refining. So it was actually just not designed. So it was inefficient. It used to take way too long to design these systems. So that was just the system problem. I guess the second problem was the space problem, real estate. Over 70% of the industrial facilities that we know today, and to give you an idea, industrial emissions all over the world today are about 12 billion tons of CO2 emissions, right? I mean, the world emits 44, 45 billion tons of CO2 emissions every year. Of that, 12 billion tons are industrial emissions. So, and 70% of those emitters have no space to build any kind of carbon capture decarbonization technology. So that's really where we started the innovations. Like, how can we compress the size of the equipment technology that we know today by 10 times, an order of magnitude, so that we can actually fit these carbon capture equipment inside these facilities and get going somewhere. That's really where we started, and that's how Cyclone CC was born. Cyclone CC is a all-in-a-box, fully modular, replicable, scalable carbon capture technology where we have compressed the size of the equipment by 10 times, reduced the steel that goes in by 35%, reduced the cement and concrete that goes in by 40%, reduced the overall capital cost by at least 50% compared to what we know today, and made it much more feasible, viable solution for decarbonizing industrial emitters versus what was available in the market before Cyclone came out. Just from a technology perspective, it uses fairly simple engineering processes of mass transfer. So how do you increase the mass transfer within the carbon capture systems? It uses fairly simple engineering principles, but matched with decent bit of complex engineering, product engineering, that then reduces the cost size of carbon capture units quite significantly.
And what happens to the captured emissions? Are they stored away? Are they utilized?
Both, actually. So as a company, we now have 49 operating sites where we are capturing carbon dioxide today in about 12 countries. In some cases, we capture the carbon dioxide and that CO2 is converted into a product like soda ash in India. It's stored into cement concrete for one of our customer sites in Japan. In Europe, we are currently working on converting captured carbon dioxide into e-fuels, X-fuels, like methanol for the shipping industry. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of utilization of CO2. And however, we'll have to realize, we will not be able to utilize hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 emissions, or maybe billion tons of CO2 emissions. So the ultimate objective for mass scale CO2 decarbonization, once you've captured the CO2, is to actually store the CO2 underground and lock it up for thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. And this is safe. This has been going on in a couple of countries, for example, in the United States, in Norway, in Middle East for decades. So it's completely safe. There is data there that you can capture and store the CO2 underground and lock it up there for ages and ages.
Do you handle the storage yourself, or do you work with partners?
We work with partners. So we have, over a period of time, we've actually developed partnerships both in terms of investment and otherwise as well. But the company today is backed by, just to give you an idea, is backed by a couple of large oil and gas companies like Chevron, Equinor, TC Energy from Canada. And all these companies are developing CO2 storage capabilities and capacities outside their existing businesses. So I think it's a very good combination where we work with industrial emitters to capture carbon dioxide from their existing sites. And then you have oil and gas companies who are now developing CO2 storage facilities. They can take over that CO2 and store it and lock it up. And they've got all the expertise there. I mean, sometimes I even say carbon capture and storage is oil and gas process in reverse. Instead of sort of digging a hole where something is locked in and then you take it out, carbon capture is just a reverse process. You capture the carbon dioxide, take the CO2 molecules back to the same hole, and store them for hundreds of thousands of years.
Thank you. Also, I wanted to ask about, since I know that your technology can be applied to the shipping industry, how exactly do you equip ships with it?
Yeah, I mean, shipping is a great example where you have an asset or you have a vessel with a life of maybe 25, 30 years, maybe sometimes more than that as well. And it's very hard to decarbonize an existing asset that's seagoing, for example, vessels. Cyclone CC, because it's so small and you can fit it inside shipping containers, so maybe 2 shipping containers, you can quite easily place the cyclone unit on a ship just next to the engine room. And where you have the exhausts containing CO2 going up in the air, you put it through the cyclone unit, and the cyclone unit captures the carbon dioxide, and you store the carbon dioxide temporarily on the ship while the ship is sailing. When the ship docks, you unload that CO2, pure CO2 that's been captured during the journey at the port, and the port can then go and permanently store it underground. This is pretty much a very feasible concept, especially from a European perspective, because majority of the CO2 storage terminals in Europe are actually coming on the ports. Be it UK, be it Norway, be it France, be it Netherlands. Majority of the CO2 storage terminals are actually on the ports. So while the ship is sailing from one port to other port, you capture the carbon dioxide on board using cyclone. You store the CO2 on board in 2 containers. And then when the ship is berthing, docking, you literally unload the CO2. We believe it's one of the cheapest ways of decarbonizing a shipping fleet within the time frame that's been set by the IMO. That's 28, 29, 2030 time frame. You can actually literally get it done today.
And do you have any partnerships that you can share with us?
Yeah.
Where this has already been implemented?
So we have the first partnership which we announced last year with Samsung for designing onboard carbon capture systems. You have to go through a certain process because it's a seagoing vessel, so the regulatory standards and approvals are a little bit different. So we have partnered with Samsung there. To give you an idea, quite a lot of ships today are actually built in either China or Korea. Quite a lot of ships. I would say probably more than 50% of world's fleet under construction today is either coming from China or from Korea. And within Korea, Samsung is a massive, massive brand name. They're probably involved in everything. So they had the experience of building the ships. They are building the ships today. And then we are partnering with them today to see how we can actually marinize our equipment so that it goes through all the checks and all the certifications. And then we go and put it on the ship. We'll probably have some news in that area very soon.
Okay. And while we're on the topic of partnerships, I know that you guys also recently signed a deal with Saudi Aramco. Can you talk about this partnership as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aramco has been a good partner to us since our Series B round, since 2020. They initially invested through Aramco Ventures. They invested some capital in our company in 2020 when Cyclone CC technology was still in early demonstration phase. And last year in November, we announced a comprehensive partnership to demonstrate our Cyclone technology at one of their sites in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The objective of this demonstration is to capture carbon dioxide from a natural gas power plant turbine exhaust stream, which is fairly hard to capture carbon dioxide from. Generally, when you burn natural gas to produce power, the fuel gas contains about 4% CO2, just 4% CO2. So to capture that CO2 from the fuel gas is fairly hard, and it's not really been demonstrated by any other technology company to date successfully. we believe we can actually do this with our technology. And, once we do it at this site, at this location, then the whole world is our theater. I mean, just think about the number of turbines operating, the amount of power that's generated from natural gas, and the future demand that's coming up, be it use of electrons for the developing countries, or be it the use of electrons for AI and data centers. I think natural gas and natural gas-based power is here to stay for some time. And this demonstration, this partnership with Aramco, allows us to actually progress the decarbonization, first of its kind deployment in low concentration CO2 atmosphere environment very quickly.
Now, to move also towards kind of bigger picture things, Aniruddha, I wanted to get your take on what you believe to be the main challenges overall within the carbon capture industry at the moment.
Yeah. So I think a couple of changes and challenges coming along within the carbon capture industry. I mean, I would say the biggest challenge is the policy certainty or uncertainty. I mean, this is a new industry, right? I mean, decarbonization, if you think about the speed with which we're trying to build decarbonization systems, it's kind of almost unprecedented right? I mean, the wood revolution, energy from wood, firing wood to some kind of optimal impact took hundreds of years. Coal, steam process took 100 years. Oil and natural gas took probably 30, 40 years. But now this is the next cycle, which is the decarbonization, a massive change in the energy transition space. We have to do it within next 10 to 15 years. I mean, we actually don't have 30 years, right? If we have to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is a scientifically agreed number in terms of avoiding the catastrophic impact of climate change, 2050 is not that far from where we are sitting. So we have to have these systems fully matured over next 10 years, maximum 15 years. So the biggest element here is the policy certainty, one, and two, policy certainty at a fairly macro scale across the borders, across the countries. The third challenge I think that we are facing within the industry is the investment landscape. The inflation's been high for some time. The borrowing costs have gone pretty significantly. The return expectations have gone pretty significantly as well. So I think society as a whole still has not fully got to a position where people are ready to accept that A, decarbonization is absolutely urgent and important, and B, somebody's got to pay for it. And we are not there yet.
Yeah. Question that just came to mind, actually, since we mentioned investments. We know pretty much the landscape in the U.S. where there's the Inflation Reduction Act and there's pretty heavy financial support for carbon capture in the United States. Europe is a bit behind in that sense, but there are certain political mechanisms already in place to support that. What's the situation like in India and the Global South in general?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think we have to realize that the decarbonization mechanisms or the incentives coming from various governments in different parts of the world are not perfect. They could be quite different from one place to other. So there's an opportunity for a lot of arbitrage in the incentives and the way the people are thinking about decarbonization. I think decarbonization is absolutely important for the global south, the developing countries. I think if I could maybe talk a little bit about India, country where I come from, I think climate change is already having a massive impact on the lives of people. So there is a realization that something must be done. And they've been going quite fast and quite big on the renewable energy. I mean, the kind of growth that you're seeing in India in terms of renewable energy deployment is just unheard of. In terms of decarbonization and carbon capture specifically, I think there is a need for technology transfer from the developed nations. And two, there's a need for concessional finance. We have to realize that we live in a world where if you're a developing country, the cost of capital is still pretty high because there is a country premium on top, which just makes it quite difficult for the government to focus or spend a fair bit of money on decarbonization when, quite a lot of people, a fair bit of people are still trying to find their daily living, find the food on a daily basis, find the electricity, access to electricity on a 24/7 basis. But the situation is changing in India, and you would see a fair bit of development coming along. I mean, if you think about the amount of steel and cement and power generation that's required in the developing nations to improve the living standards of people, there's no choice for them not to use the resources available to these countries. And if they keep using the resources, they would have to use carbon capture in one or the other format. I think I'm pretty privileged that we've had the opportunity to work with a couple of emitters in India and install carbon capture projects at chemical sites, at power plants, and at steel plant in India. And last year, we actually announced another project based on cyclone CC technology for one of the largest steel producers in India, JSW, where we'll help them capture 100,000 tons of CO2 emissions from one of their facilities in India. So you're seeing lots of action that's starting to come from the private players in India or in developing countries in general, and I expect that trend would continue.
And I hope so. Would you mind actually expanding on that a little bit? Like, how do you see this industry shaping up this year, like in 2025 specifically, but also beyond, realistically speaking?
For the developing countries or for the developed world?
For both.
Okay, all right. I mean, Aniruddha, I think my hope and my wish for this year is this is the mega year for climate action, where there's clear, consistent policy, there's clear, consistent funding available, and there's clear and consistent goals and targets agreed at international level for achieving the net zero ambition by 2050. So that's my sort of hope for 2025. But I think just for this year, we see there would be a little bit of slowdown right now in the decarbonization space. It's like I said, I mean, the borrowing costs have been high for quite some time now, and it seems like if you look at the predictions coming from the central bankers, it'll probably remain high this year as well. So it's actually starting to hit companies and their borrowing costs in terms of decarbonization. So I expect there would be a little bit of slowdown this year in the market. The market will consolidate as well. However, I also think that there are opportunities to potentially develop good business and fairly good business models for 26, 27, 28 and beyond. I mean, the biggest factor, which is quite clear, I guess, to everybody now, is the power requirement of the data centers and AI-related data centers. I think that's a phenomenon that's not going to reverse. We actually think that the power demand, especially based on natural gas, is going to increase extremely significantly all over the world, developed countries, developing countries. And the demand for decarbonization from the large users of computing capacity kind of keep increasing as well. There will be constant pressure to do that. So I think technologies that can help decarbonize power generation for data centers and or for tech companies, I think they certainly are going to thrive this year.
Excellent. Aniruddha, I have one last question for you before we wrap up this episode, and that is about Carbon Clean's plans for the future. What upcoming developments can we look forward to?
Right. So I guess 2025, like I said, is kind of quite an exciting year for us. I am looking forward to demonstrating the technology with Saudi Aramco. We signed the partnership like we discussed in November, so now it's time to actually boots on the ground, start executing. I'm also looking forward to putting carbon capture at the back of a ship. That is something that we may announce something in a couple of months' time. So that's progressing quite well. However, I think we'll be focusing a lot of our energy this year, specifically for Cyclone, on decarbonizing the gas assets for AI. We have actually, I'm not sure if I mentioned or not, but we've actually built an internal platform using AI to help our customers operate the carbon capture plants in the best and the most efficient way and fashion. We've already done that. It's already happening now, and we've kind of started operating it for a few of our customers. So I'm actually looking to expand the offering, more of that offering into the market, but also at the same point of time working with some of the large tech companies to think about how we can provide them with clean electrons in places or locations where green electrons are just not available. And this is not just a US phenomenon. I think this is the phenomenon that's going to reverberate across US, Canada, Europe, Middle East, India, Singapore, other developing countries as well.
Wonderful. It certainly does sound like a very exciting 2025 that's shaping up for climate action in general. Aniruddha, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a real pleasure to speak with you today and learn about all the important work that you guys are doing at Carbon Clean. Thank you so much.
Super. Well, thank you for having me here.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.